Camp McCain, Mississippi, July 1944. The mess hall smelled of cinnamon and sugar and butter, scents that drifted through humid evening air and made men stop mid-conversation to identify the source. Dessert had been announced: apple pie, baked fresh that afternoon by American cooks who had decided prisoners deserved something beyond the standard institutional fare. 40 German soldiers sat at long tables, staring at slices placed before them, golden crust flaking at the touch of forks, steam rising from fruit filling that glistened in the overhead lights. Most had never seen anything like it. The propaganda had promised American privation, food shortages, a nation too weak to feed even its own people. Instead, they were being served pie, not as special occasion treat, but as ordinary weeknight dessert. Their faces, when they took that first bite, would reveal everything about propaganda's collapse and truth's undeniable power. Werner Muller had grown up in his family's bakery in Stuttgart, where his mother and grandmother had made strudel and torts and all manner of German pastries that required skill and patience and ingredients that were increasingly scarce as the 1930s progressed into the 1940s. He remembered the particular alchemy of baking, how flour and butter and sugar transformed through heat into something that was more than the sum of its parts, how the smell of baking could fill a shop and draw customers from blocks away, how his mother's hands had moved with practiced precision through dough that was simultaneously forgiving and demanding. The regime's rise had changed the bakery. First came restrictions on Jewish customers, then on Jewish suppliers, then the disappearance of certain ingredients as rationing began, and as the war economy prioritized military production over civilian consumption. Sugar became scarce, butter was rationed, even flour quality declined as better grain was diverted to feed soldiers rather than to make cakes for celebrations that the regime considered frivolous anyway. By 1941, when Werner was conscripted, his mother was making ersatz pastries, using whatever substitutes she could find, honey instead of sugar, when available margarine instead of butter, questionable flour that made crust that was gray and dense rather than golden and flaky. The bakery continued operating, but it was a shadow of what it had been, producing bread and simple rolls for customers who had less money and fewer occasions for celebration. Werner's military service had taken him to North Africa, where baking was the furthest thing from anyone's mind, and where meals consisted of whatever could be, transported and preserved through desert heat and supply line difficulties. He had eaten military rations that were designed for nutrition rather than enjoyment, had become accustomed to food that was fuel rather than pleasure, had learned to ignore his baker's sensibility that insisted food should taste good and not just keep soldiers alive. His capture in Tunisia had been almost relief, not from danger exactly, since surrender carried its own uncertainties, but from the grinding reality of fighting a losing campaign with inadequate supplies and diminishing hope. The British had processed him efficiently, had fed him better than his own army had fed him in the final months, and had eventually transferred him to American custody for transport to camps in the United States. The voyage across the Atlantic had been Werner's first exposure to American abundance. The food on the ship wasn't elaborate, but it was adequate and regular 3 meals a day, portions that satisfied rather than just staving off hunger, variety that suggested supply chains functioning smoothly rather than barely holding together. He had eaten and wondered how a nation supposedly suffering from industrial collapse could feed prisoners better than Germany fed its own soldiers. Camp McCain materialized as rows of wooden barracks sprawling across Mississippi landscape that was flat and humid and green in ways that German landscapes rarely achieved, even in summer. The camp was new, built specifically for housing prisoners, with facilities that looked temporary but were well constructed and adequately equipped. Werner had been assigned to a work detail in the camp kitchen, his bakery background making him valuable to American cooks, who were trying to feed thousands of prisoners and needed men who understood food preparation beyond basic military cooking. The head cook was a sergeant named Taylor from somewhere in Georgia, who ran the kitchen with casual efficiency and a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of how to produce decent food on institutional scale. Taylor spoke no German, and Werner's English was minimal, but they communicated through the universal language of cooking gestures and demonstrations, and the particular understanding that people who know food develop regardless of linguistic barriers. Taylor let Werner help with bread production, trusted him with measurements and mixing, and the timing that separated good bread from mediocre bread. It was honest work that reminded Werner of his family bakery, that used skills he thought he'd lost to military service, that gave him purpose beyond just waiting for repatriation to whatever remained of Germany and his family. But Taylor also showed Werner things that made his baker-s heart ache with equal parts wonder and sadness. The ingredients available in the American military kitchen would have seemed luxurious in Stuttgart even before rationing white flour that was fine and pure sugar in quantities that seemed wasteful, butter that was real and fresh eggs and milk and vanilla and spices that German bakers had been hoarding or substituting for years. Taylor made pies, not for special occasions or holidays, but regularly as standard dessert rotation. Apple pies, cherry pies, peach pies when peaches were in season. He made them with the casual abundance of someone who had never questioned whether ingredients would be available, who took American agricultural capacity for granted the way Werner had once taken breathing for granted, who baked pies because soldiers liked pie, and the kitchen had the resources to provide what soldiers liked. Werner watched Taylor make apple pie for the first time with professional fascination and personal devastation. The crust was proper pastry butter cut into flour until the mixture resembled coarse meal ice water, added just until dough came together, rolled thin, and fitted into pie tins with the practiced ease of someone who had done this hundreds of times. The filling was fresh apples, actual apples, not dried fruit or preserves, sliced and tossed with sugar and cinnamon, and a touch of flour to thicken the juice that would release during baking. Taylor assembled pies with efficient speed, filled maybe 40 tins in an hour, placed them in industrial ovens that could hold dozens of pies simultaneously. The baking filled the kitchen with smell that made Werner want to cry cinnamon and butter and caramelizing sugar, scent that connected him to his mother's bakery, into a Germany that had existed before the regime had prioritized ideology over beauty and pleasure and the simple human joy of eating something delicious. The pies emerged golden and perfect, crusts flaking in ways that indicated proper butter content and correct mixing technique, filling bubbling at the edges and creating patterns that looked like abstract art. Taylor let them cool slightly and cut them into generous slices and sent them to the mess hall for evening meal as dessert service. Werner had followed one tray of pie slices, had watched as they were placed at serving stations, had seen German prisoners stare at unfamiliar dessert with expressions that mixed confusion and suspicion and longing. And he had understood that what Taylor casually produced as ordinary institutional dessert represented something profound evidence of American capacity that propaganda had claimed didn't exist, proof of abundance that the regime had insisted was impossible for decadent democracy to maintain during wartime. That had been 3 weeks ago. Since then, Werner had helped Taylor make pies regularly, had learned American techniques that were different from German baking, but no less valid, had slowly accepted that the abundance was real rather than elaborate deception designed to confuse prisoners about American capabilities. But he had also felt the weight of what that abundance meant, that Germany had lost, not just militarily, but materially, that the regime's promises about enemy weakness had been comprehensively false, that years of sacrifice and privation had been in service of delusions rather than achievable goals. Tonight, Taylor was making apple pie again. Werner had helped with the preparation, peeling apples using mechanical peeler that processed fruit in seconds rather than minutes, mixing filling in huge bowls that held enough for a dozen pies, rolling dough on marble surfaces that stayed cool even in Mississippi heat. The pies were in the ovens, now filling the kitchen with that heartbreaking smell of cinnamon and sugar and butter and eyed. Werner knew that when they emerged, they would be perfect, and that perfection would mean something more than just good dessert. The evening meal at Camp McCain was standard fare meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, bread. Adequate food, properly prepared, nothing exceptional, but nothing deliberately inadequate either. The prisoners ate with practiced efficiency, men who had learned to appreciate regular meals after experiencing hunger during the war's final chaotic months. Werner worked the serving line, helping distribute food alongside American kitchen staff. He ladled mashed potatoes onto trays, watched German prisoners move through the line, accepting food that would have seemed abundant in wartime. Germany, but was merely normal by American military standards. He knew what was coming for dessert, had helped prepare it, and he was both eager and apprehensive about how the other prisoners would react. The meal portion concluded. Trays were cleared. Then Taylor announced dessert apple pie, 1 slice per prisoner, fresh from the ovens. American kitchen workers began placing pie slices at serving stations, and the prisoners who were still finishing their main courses looked up with expressions that Werner recognized. Confusion about what this unfamiliar dessert was. Suspicion about whether it was actually meant for them. Uncertainty about whether accepting it would create obligations or expose them to mockery. Werner's friend Klaus approached the serving line, received his pie slice, and stared at it with the particular bewilderment of someone encountering food they had no cultural reference for understanding. Klaus had been a factory worker from Hamburg, had never traveled outside Germany before military service, had limited experience with cuisines that weren't explicitly German. He looked at the pie golden crust, steam rising from fruit filling, the whole thing looking almost too perfect to be real, and asked Werner in German, "What is this?" "Apple pie," Werner explained, also in German. "American dessert. Apples with sugar and cinnamon, baked in pastry crust. Very sweet. You'll like it." Klaus carried his tray to a table where several other prisoners were gathering, all staring at their pie slices with similar expressions of uncertainty. Werner watched from the serving line, seeing his fellow prisoners confront this symbol of American abundance, this casual dessert that represented everything propaganda had claimed. Americans didn't have resources to spare for sweets ingredients for making frivolous food capacity to provide pleasure rather than just sustenance. The first bite would be revelation. Werner knew this because he had tasted. Taylor's pie already had experienced the shock of flavor that was simultaneously familiar and foreign, had felt his baker's trained palate recognize quality while his war-shaped expectations couldn't reconcile that quality with everything he had been taught about American weakness. Klaus cut a piece with his fork, raised it to his mouth, hesitated briefly as if expecting trap or trick. Then he bit down, and Werner saw his face transform. First came recognition of temperature. The pie was still warm from the ovens, the filling releasing heat that was just this side of too hot, but was perfect for emphasizing the sweet apple flavor. Then came taste sugar and cinnamon and butter, and apple combining in harmony that was deliberately engineered to be delicious. That was designed to provide pleasure rather than just calories. Klaus's eyes widened. His jaw stopped moving for a moment as his brain processed what his taste buds were reporting. Then he chewed slowly, swallowed, and immediately took another bite, larger this time, no longer cautious, but eager to confirm that the first impression was accurate and repeatable. Around him, other prisoners were having similar reactions: shock, confusion, delight, the particular expression of people tasting something that exceeded their expectations so dramatically that cognitive adjustment was required. Werner moved between tables, ostensibly to clear dishes, but actually to observe reactions, to watch as German prisoners encountered American pie and had their assumptions about American privation destroyed by a simple act of eating good dessert. The expressions were varied, but shared common themes: surprise at the quality, confusion about how prisoners could be served such food, growing recognition that everything they had been told about American weakness was false. An older prisoner named Schmidt, a veteran of the previous war who had been skeptical about regime propaganda from the start, caught Werner's eye and said quietly in German, "This is better than anything I ate in Germany before I was conscripted. Better than what I could afford, even when I was working steady and had money. How can they give this to prisoners?" Werner didn't have good answer. He had been asking himself the same question since arriving at Camp McCain, had watched American abundance, and had struggled to reconcile it with years of propaganda about enemy collapse. The only explanation that made sense was the one Werner had been avoiding, that American capacity was real, that German intelligence had been wrong or deliberately deceptive, that the regime had sent soldiers to fight a war that mathematics made unwinnable. Some prisoners ate their pie quickly, almost frantically, as if expecting it to be taken away if they didn't finish fast enough. Others ate slowly, savoring each bite, trying to make the experience last. A few didn't eat at all, just stared at the pie with expressions that suggested they were overwhelmed by what it represented, not the dessert itself, but the evidence that everything they had believed was false. Ernst, who had fought alongside Werner in North Africa and had shared the journey to American captivity, sat with pie slice untouched, tears running down his face. Werner sat beside him, said nothing, just waited for Ernst to explain when ready. "My wife wrote that she's been using turnips instead of apples for pies," Ernst said finally, "because apples are expensive and scarce. She apologized in her letter for not being able to make proper desserts, for having to substitute and compromise because ingredients aren't available. And here we are prisoners in enemy country, being served apple pie made with real apples and real butter, and real sugar dessert that's better than what my wife can make at home, even though she is free, and we recaptive. How do I explain this to her? How do I write a letter saying that Americans feed their prisoners better than Germany feeds its civilians?" Werner had no answer. The injustice was real German families scraping by with substitutes and rationing, while German prisoners in America ate desserts that would have been luxuries in peacetime. But the injustice revealed uncomfortable truth, that Germany had lost the war before fighting started. That challenging American capacity had been catastrophic miscalculation, that the regime had squandered German resources and lives in pursuit of victory that was never mathematically possible. Over the following days, Werner continued helping in the kitchen, learning American cooking techniques while observing how Taylor and the other cooks approached food preparation. The philosophy was different from what Werner had learned in his family bakery. German baking emphasized precision, exact measurements, specific temperatures, careful timing that brooked no variation. American cooking was looser, more forgiving, emphasizing results over process, and allowing for adaptation based on available ingredients and circumstances. Taylor let Werner make pie one afternoon, supervised but granted autonomy over the process. Werner mixed dough using American measurements that were less precise than German standards, but somehow still produced consistent results. He cut butter into flour by hand, feeling the texture change as fat coated flour particles, achieving the crumbly consistency that would create flaky crust after baking. He added ice water gradually, bringing dough together without overworking it, rolling it thin on the marble surface that stayed cool despite the July heat outside. The apple filling was straightforward sliced apples tossed with sugar and cinnamon, and a bit of flour to thicken juice. Werner tasted the mixture before adding it to pie tins, adjusted sugar slightly, added a touch more cinnamon because he knew German palates preferred more spice than Americans typically used. He assembled pies with care, crimped edges to seal top and bottom crusts, cut vent holes to allow steam escape, brushed tops with beaten egg to promote browning. The baking was the crucial part. Werner set timer, but also relied on his nose, the smell that indicated caramelization was beginning, but hadn't yet progressed to burning. The scent that said crust was browning and fruit was bubbling, and the whole thing was approaching the perfect moment of doneness. He pulled pies when they looked right, when the combination of color and smell told him that waiting longer would overcook them, while removing them earlier would undercook them. Taylor inspected the results, nodded approval, said something in English that Werner couldn't fully understand, but whose tone conveyed satisfaction. The pies were good, not perfect, perhaps, not quite achieving the effortless excellence of Taylor's work, but solid and well-made, and proof that Werner's skills translated across culinary cultures, even if the specific techniques and philosophies differed. That evening's dessert was Werner's pies. He watched from the kitchen as prisoners received slices, saw their reactions mirror what he had observed earlier: surprise, delight, the particular expression of people tasting something unexpectedly good. Klaus caught his eye from across the mess hall, raised his fork in salute, smiled in ways that suggested he understood that Werner had made this batch and was acknowledging the connection to home and to happier times that baking represented. After dinner service concluded, Taylor invited Werner to his office, a small room off the kitchen where the head cook managed inventory and paperwork. He poured coffee, offered cup to Werner, spoke in slow English while drawing pictures and using gestures to supplement his limited German vocabulary. "You make good pie," Taylor said. "Better than most of my regular staff. You were baker before the war?" Werner nodded, tried to explain in broken English about his family shop in Stuttgart, about the traditions of German baking that his mother had taught him, about the particular pride that came from producing something beautiful that made people happy. Taylor listened carefully, asked questions through their improvised communication system, began to understand Werner's background and the skills he possessed. "After the war, you go back to baking?" Taylor asked. Werner considered. The question assumed there would be an after the war, assumed he would survive captivity and repatriation, assumed Stuttgart would still have bakeries and customers and ingredients sufficient for actual baking rather than just producing gray bread from poor flour and dubious substitutes. It assumed a future that Werner wanted to believe in, but couldn't quite envision, given everything that had been lost. "I hope so," Werner said carefully in English. "If Stuttgart still exists, if my family still has the shop, if there are ingredients to use." Taylor's expression showed understanding. He had apparently heard enough stories from prisoners to grasp that Germany was being devastated, that cities were being bombed into rubble, that the Germany prisoners would return to would be very different from the Germany they had left. He didn't offer false reassurance, didn't pretend Werner's concerns were unfounded. Instead, he said something that Werner would remember for decades. Good bakers are always needed. People always want bread and pies. Whatever's left of Germany after this, you'll be able to bake. The skills don't disappear just because buildings get destroyed. You rebuild. You find ingredients. You make what you can with what you have. That's what bakers do. The words were simple but profound. Werner felt something shift in his thinking, not quite hope, but something adjacent to it, recognition that skills and hot skills, knowledge persisted even when physical infrastructure was destroyed, that he possessed abilities that would have value regardless of what Germany looked like after surrender and occupation. He could bake. People would need bakers. The rest was details that would resolve somehow, even if he couldn't predict exactly how. By August, pie had become regular feature of Camp McCain's menu rotation. Not every day the kitchen varied desserts to prevent monotony, but frequently enough that prisoners came to expect and anticipate it, to look forward to evenings when apple pie or cherry pie or occasionally peach pie appeared on serving trays and reminded everyone that American capacity was real rather than propaganda invention. Werner had become unofficial assistant to Taylor, working in the kitchen daily, helping prepare food that fed thousands of prisoners and hundreds of guards. The work was demanding but satisfying, gave him purpose beyond just waiting for the war to end, let him use skills that connected him to his pre-war identity as baker, rather than his wartime identity as soldier and prisoner. The other prisoners began asking Werner about pie. How was it made? Why did American pie taste different from German pastries? Could Werner teach them to make it so they could replicate the dessert after returning to Germany? Werner answered questions patiently, explained techniques, shared knowledge that Taylor had shared with him, became informal cooking instructor for prisoners who wanted to learn skills they could use in post-war lives they were beginning to imagine again. Klaus expressed interest in learning to bake, not professionally like Werner, but sufficiently to make basic desserts for his family after repatriation. Werner taught him during evening free time, using improvised materials to demonstrate technique without access to actual ingredients. He showed Klaus how to cut butter into flour using 2 knives, how to roll dough to even thickness, how to judge doneness by smell and color rather than just following recipe timings. The lessons became social events. Other prisoners gathered to watch and learn, to ask questions, to participate in planning for futures that depended on Germany surviving defeat and prisoners surviving repatriation. The conversations were often somber, discussing what they would find upon return, whether families had survived bombing, whether homes still existed, but they were also practical, focused on acquiring skills and knowledge that would be useful in whatever circumstances awaited. Ernst asked Werner to write down recipes, to create something he could take home and share with his wife so she could make American-style pie if ingredients became available in post-war Germany. Werner wrote carefully in German, translating American measurements into German equivalents, annotating with explanations about why specific techniques mattered and what could be substituted if certain ingredients weren't available. The recipe became a document that circulated among prisoners, copied and recopied, annotated with additions and questions and suggestions from men who were thinking about peacetime cooking rather than just surviving captivity. It was small thing a pie recipe, but it represented something larger. Hope that there would be future where such recipes mattered. Belief that normal life would eventually return. Faith that the skills and knowledge accumulated during captivity would have application beyond just passing time until release. Taylor noticed the recipe circulation and was amused rather than concerned. He encouraged Werner to teach more widely, to share American cooking techniques with any prisoner who wanted to learn, to use kitchen knowledge as bridge between enemies who were beginning to recognize their shared humanity despite the war that had made them enemies. One evening, Taylor organized baking demonstration for larger group, maybe 30 prisoners who had expressed interest in learning American cooking. Werner and Taylor worked together, demonstrating pie construction from start to finish, explaining each step, answering questions through their improvised German-English communication system that had become surprisingly effective despite linguistic barriers. The demonstration was successful. Prisoners watched carefully, took notes, asked intelligent questions that showed they understood not just the mechanics, but the principles behind the techniques. They wanted to know why ice water rather than room temperature water, why butter rather than lard, why specific ratios of flour to fat produced flakier crust. Werner answered as thoroughly as he could, sharing his baker's knowledge accumulated over years of training and practice. After the demonstration concluded, an older prisoner named Hoffman approached Werner privately and said something that captured what many were feeling. "This is the strangest captivity imaginable. We're prisoners of war, defeated enemies who should be treated harshly. Instead, we being taught to bake American desserts by American cooks who treat us like culinary students rather than like threats. Every lesson we learn is evidence that propaganda was lies, that Americans aren't what we were told, that the regime sent us to fight based on false premises. The pie isn't just dessert, it's proof that we were deceived." Werner nodded, understanding. Hoffman had articulated what Werner had been thinking, but hadn't quite found words for expressing, that the pie lessons weren't just about learning cooking techniques, but about confronting the systematic deception that had characterized regime propaganda, about recognizing that enemies were humans who could be teachers, and that defeat had revealed truths that victory would have continued to obscure. September brought news that the war in Europe was winding toward inevitable conclusion. American newspapers available in the camp reported Allied advances, German defensive collapses, the systematic compression of territory the regime controlled. Prisoners read these reports with mixed emotions: relief that the fighting would end, grief for what Germany was losing, fear about what they would face upon repatriation to nation that had been thoroughly defeated. Werner thought about his family's bakery, wondered if the building still stood, whether his mother had survived the bombing, that Hamburg had endured, whether there would be anything to return to beyond rebel and refugees, and the massive task of rebuilding from near total destruction. The uncertainty was crushing, but the baking helped. Every pie he made was practice for the post-war life he wanted to believe was possible. Every lesson he taught was investment in skills that would have value, regardless of what specific circumstances awaited in Germany. The final pie lesson came in October, when Werner taught a group of 20 prisoners how to make apple pie entirely on their own, with minimal supervision, demonstrating that they had learned sufficiently to replicate what they had been taught. The prisoners worked carefully, measuring ingredients, mixing dough, assembling pies with the concentrated attention of students who wanted to prove they had mastered the material. The pies were imperfect crusts, too thick in some cases, filling too sweet in others, edges burned slightly on a few where timing wasn't quite right. But they were recognizably pies, were edible, and mostly good, were proof that German prisoners had learned American baking techniques and could produce American desserts given appropriate ingredients and equipment. That evening's dessert was the student-made pies, served alongside pies that Werner and Taylor had made for comparison. Prisoners ate both, could taste the differences, could recognize which were professionally made and which were amateur productions. But they also understood that the amateur pies were achievements, were evidence of learning and skill development, and preparation for futures that required practical knowledge rather than just theoretical understanding. Klaus sought out Werner after dinner, thanked him for the lessons, said that he would make pie for his wife when he got home, that he would teach his children to bake American style if ingredients permitted. The gratitude was touching, but also melancholy. Klaus was assuming reunion with family that might not have survived, return to home that might not exist, future that depended on countless variables beyond his control. Werner wrote a final letter home that evening, trying to explain to his mother what he had learned in American captivity, how enemy cooks had taught him techniques he would bring back to Germany, how the simple act of making pie had become symbol of hope and preparation for post-war life. He didn't know if the letter would reach her, didn't know if she was alive to receive it, but he wrote anyway, because writing was practice for the future he wanted to believe would come. By December, Werner was among the early prisoners selected for repatriation. The war was essentially over, and American authorities were beginning to process prisoners for return to Germany through whatever systems could be established in the chaos of occupation and reconstruction. Werner said goodbye to Taylor, thanked him for the lessons and the patience and the treatment that had been far better than propaganda had predicted, received a handwritten copy of Taylor's pie recipe as parting gift. The recipe was written in English, but Werner could read it now. His months in the kitchen had taught him enough English that he could follow. American recipes could understand measurements and techniques, could bridge culinary cultures. Through language he had learned while making desserts that had changed how he understood enemies and capacity and the systematic lies that had characterized regime propaganda. Werner Müller returned to Stuttgart in March 1946, to a city that was mostly rubble. His family's bakery was destroyed, the building reduced to partial walls and charred beams. But his mother had survived, living in a displaced persons camp, and together they began planning how to rebuild. The rebuilding took years. Stuttgart's reconstruction was slow, hampered by lack of resources and by the sheer scale of destruction that Allied bombing had inflicted. But Werner worked first in temporary facilities, later in rebuilt shops, eventually in a new location. When the old site proved unsuitable for construction, given the damage to surrounding infrastructure. He made American-style pie when ingredients permitted. The recipe Taylor had given him was adapted for German tastes and ingredients, sometimes using different apples sometimes, substituting for ingredients that weren't available, always maintaining the core principles that Taylor had taught him about creating flaky crust and flavorful filling. The pies were novelties at first, curiosities that drew customers who wanted to taste American desserts that Werner had learned to make in captivity. But they became popular, became signature offerings that distinguished Werner's bakery from competitors, became connection to the past and symbol of resilience that made something good from experience that could have destroyed him. He taught others, including Klaus, who had survived and returned to Hamburg and who visited Stuttgart specifically to refresh his pie-making skills that he wanted to teach his children. The lessons became tradition, knowledge passing from former prisoner to families who appreciated both the dessert and the story behind it, how German soldiers had learned American baking in captivity, how enemies had become teachers, how simple act of making pie had revealed truths about propaganda and capacity, and the humanity that persisted even during war's worst moments. When Werner's son asked why American pie was important enough to keep making decades after the war ended, Werner tried to explain. The pie was evidence. Evidence that we had been lied to about American weakness, that the regime had sent us to fight based on false promises, that capacity and abundance we were told didn't exist were actually real. Every pie I make reminds me that truth matters more than comfortable lies, that evidence should shape beliefs, that the willingness to learn from enemies can teach us things we need to know. The recipe Taylor had given him remained in the family, passed down through generations, adapted and modified, but maintaining its essential character. It became more than just instructions for making dessert. It became document representing complicated history, moment when enemies had chosen teaching over hostility, time when simple act of baking had revealed truths that propaganda had tried to hide. Werner baked until his death in 1987, making American-style pies alongside traditional German pastries, maintaining skills he had learned in captivity, honoring memory of Taylor and the other American cooks who had treated German prisoners with unexpected generosity. His bakery became a minor landmark in Stuttgart, known for both traditional German baking and for American desserts that connected present to complicated past. The most important lesson wasn't about baking technique or ingredient ratios. It was about the power of evidence to dissolve propaganda, about how direct experience could shatter beliefs that seemed solid, about how something as simple as pie could reveal truths about capacity and humanity that years of propaganda had tried to obscure. Werner had tasted American pie in Mississippi prisoner camp and had understood, with devastating clarity, that everything he had been taught about enemies was false. That understanding had shaped his entire post-war life, his refusal to accept easy narratives about German victimhood, his insistence on truth over comfortable lies, his commitment to building something better from the ruins of what propaganda and ideology had destroyed. The pie had been beginning of wisdom that came too late to prevent catastrophe, but might help future generations avoid repeating the same mistakes.